Welcome into the Odds and Audibles podcast. If you're not on video, I'm sorry. Matt Preem, Eric Scopel, Jared Mack on this Tuesday, beautiful Tuesday in Eugene. Nice, crisp fall, or maybe now winter. I don't know what season it is, but nice, cool, crisp Tuesday, getting you ready for this Oregon versus Utah matchup, senior day, final home game of the season. And it's also the first chance that Oregon will get to move past that tough loss last weekend at home to Washington. And we'll start right there with the injuries. There's a lot of questions where things are at with Oregon from a health standpoint going into this game. Don't know much. We know Bo Nix left the game, returned, but he had an injury. We know Alex Forsyth left the game, didn't finish. We know Ryan Walk was seen in a boot. He did not finish that football game. I'm trying to think if there were any other injuries that popped up. But Dan being very cryptic Monday night, guys. And I think we kind of expected this, saying that he's not going to talk too much beyond saying that they got maybe some better than expected news, but he wasn't going to dive into anything injury related. We tried multiple times of getting various information, and now it's left to us of kind of wondering, what does maybe this small positive news mean? Does it mean that one guy's back? Does it mean that these aren't season-ending injuries and they're just out a week? That's going to be one of the biggest questions going around this program going into Saturday. It's just kind of the status, and we probably won't know until guys come out on Saturday afternoon, or I should say Saturday evening, for kickoff.
I'll read Dan's quote, and then I think we have to acknowledge another part of this, which keeps it even more cryptic. But here's exactly what Dan said when asked about injuries. I'm not going to share really any update with anyone. We came away dinged in that game. I will say that I feel a lot more positive today after getting to hear some news on where things are at right now. So that was what Dan said Monday night. Tuesday, Wednesday's practices. I know you're listening to this podcast on a Tuesday. We will not have any practice reports. We got out to practice today. We were instructed by Oregon officials and Dan himself that they didn't want any information on injuries out. So we saw things, but we're not going to talk about what we saw to maintain relationships with the program. Someone on our message board was like, why aren't you guys sharing it? Why do you have to listen to the officials? Well, if we don't, we lose access. Everybody hates us over there.
We won't be able to go to practice anymore.
Ever. We would never be able to go to practice, and no one would ever be able to go to practice. So it would be very short-sighted to make that choice. It would also help Utah, which was one of the things that has been told to us, is that there's no competitive advantage to having this information out there. So we saw things on Tuesday. I think Jared and I'll probably both go out Wednesday, even though we're not going to write a practice report, just to get an update further, kind of a better idea of where things are at. But don't expect practice reports from us. If you're used to reading them, that's why they're not there. If you want an explanation, but that leaves us with the same. That leaves us knowing far less this week, or at least being able to share far less this week than we normally have. Usually, we're on the show on a Tuesday saying, "Hey, this is who was at Tuesday's practice. This is what they were doing. This is what we think that means." We don't have that kind of information today, unfortunately. Or if we do have that information, we're not free to share it. So I hate that we're in that situation. Obviously, I'd prefer not to, but I'm also understanding of three very important parts of this team, including the starting quarterback, are dealing with an injury of some kind, and you're going into a game against the defending Pac-12 champions, a team that beat you 2 times last year, and that if you don't beat this year, you lose your own opportunity to make it to the conference championship. So I'm understanding of it. It's disappointing. It's too bad. But I think kind of the way we have to look at this is, as Matt said, you're going to have an idea right around kickoff Saturday. We'll be up in the press box at Autzen Stadium, usually by about 6:30, 6:45, 7. We've got a pretty good idea of who's available, and we will be sharing that information on social media and on duckterritory.com. So be sure to check that out. But from a podcast perspective, you won't be hearing a concrete update this week unless Dan changes protocols tomorrow, says we can watch things and write about it, or comes out and says at his press conference, "Hey, I've totally changed my mind. I actually don't think there's not a competitive advantage. Here's how everyone's feeling. Ryan's doing this, and Alex is feeling this, and I'll tell you about Bo. Let me walk you through exactly how he's doing. Barring some sort of bizarre turn of events, you're going to have very little information this week.
Yeah. I don't really have anything else to add other than if Bizarro World Dan shows up on Wednesday, then maybe everybody in the western half of the United States will know that these people are doing X. But other than that, just like what Eric said, don't expect a practice report from him or I this week. Like Eric said, we'll be there tomorrow, but we will not be writing anything about it. And that's our choice. That is the university's choice. That is the proper decision in this instance. This is not another message board post about the freedom of the press. It's like, no, this is a win-win for both situations, for us from our journalistic perspective, and then for the university for their competitive advantage perspective. So don't expect that, and don't expect any more injury talk on this podcast, because that's all I have.
Well, I was going to say one thing.
And
we've in previous seasons and previous weeks this year, we've seen guys show up to practice throughout the week and not play on Saturday. And we've also seen guys not show up to practice and then get on the football field. So things could also change from where Oregon is thinking they're going to be at during the week. And so it's literally up in the air for everybody that was dealing with some kind of an injury going up into Utah week. Now, that Washington game also produced a lot of questionable decisions made by Dan Lanning and the Oregon coaching staff. And I wrote a column like, hey, he made a couple decisions that opened the door for Oregon to lose that game against Washington. He came forward and even admitted that, Saturday night, that there were some things that when they work, he's praised, and when they don't work, he's ridiculed. He was first to say that. And Monday night, after reviewing the film, he said that there were multiple instances in which maybe they would have rather done X instead of doing Y or Z in that football game. I don't know if he specifically ever referenced one exact moment beyond just the Bo Nix substitution question. If you were on TV, you certainly saw it. If you were at the game and you listened to the podcast, you probably didn't see it unless you went and rewatched the game. But that fourth down call in their own territory late in the fourth quarter, Ty Thompson was in the game. It was 4th and 1. And Bo Nix was shown on TV trying to get himself back into the game. He was asked for clarification about why Bo didn't go in, why they didn't call a timeout to get him in. And Dan's reasoning was he hadn't yet heard officially from Oregon's medical staff that he was cleared. He heard from Bo. That was very clear. But the medical staff hadn't told him yet that he was good to go. And by the time that they did, the play was already happening. It was too late to call timeout for that. But Dan did admit that in hindsight, they didn't like the look. They probably still should have called the timeout anyways to change the play call. And if you go and you look at the play and you press pause, it's disastrous. That play had no chance of success unless Ty improvised and threw the ball. And then there were a couple other moments where he never really specifically said, this is why we should have done this differently. But he came forward saying that there were multiple times that in hindsight, they probably should have done something different because the look wasn't there and they still did it. I think the most notable one is the kickoff, the onside kick. Dan Saturday night said that the key that they were scouting all week to do it wasn't there, and they did it anyways. And then Monday afternoon, Washington's coaching staff came out and said that, yeah, we knew some things were funky and we kind of adjusted it. And when they've had different numbers out there, we alerted our kickoff return unit to be ready for an onside kick. And sure enough, they did it. So that's one instance that we know that, hey, it wasn't there. They did it anyways, and it cost them 3 points. But this is the growth that you want to see, I think, from Dan Lanning and this young staff is they're being aggressive. That's awesome. And they're identifying the mistakes that they're making when being aggressive and then taking the steps to prevent that from happening in future games.
To the fourth down thing, here's how I read that as. Bo Nix would have checked out of that. They're used to having a veteran quarterback who sees that look and goes, hey, this is not going to work, right? And maybe there was a belief that Ty could identify that. Maybe it was a false belief. And I'm in complete agreement. When you see it, and of course we only saw it live, and Noah slips, and you kind of go like, "Gosh, if he doesn't slip, does he get it?" That play was dead on arrival. When that ball was snapped, that play was dead. You have your
chance.
You've got your backup quarterback in there who I think if that's Bo would look up and say, "Oh boy, this play is not going to work." They've overloaded. They had like everyone in the box. They knew exactly what was coming. They tipped it. I think I saw a couple people on social media who are a little smarter with me on some of the X and O stuff say that like Washington never showed that look all game until that play because they knew there was no threat of Ty keeping the football.
There was no.
That they knew exactly where it was going, or of Ty keeping it and passing the football where he would have had. I mean, if he would have kept it and decided to throw the ball and looked up, those receivers could have scored touchdowns potentially. I mean, there was nothing over there. So I think the timeout probably didn't feel like it needed to be taken. Maybe in an instance here, just because of you think your quarterback's going to identify it because you're used to having a quarterback who does identify these things and make changes, which is the difference again of a Bo Nix and a Ty Thompson, one guy who's got so much experience, one guy who lacks some of that experience. So that's something I thought about as well, just to put a little more context maybe to some of the decision making there. But I thought it was again. I'm impressed with some of the things, the same things that Matt is with regards to the taking of accountability here. And I've been impressed by every player that's come out and spoke. Like again, we have to commend Bennett Williams. I know we've been critical of him the last 48, 72 hours. I think rightfully so in terms of the play, but I have to really commend just like what Tyler Shuck did in 2020, coming out after really tough losses where he played really poorly and saying, "Hey, I played like crap." Anthony Brown did the same thing after Stanford. And I commend the athlete, especially these 19 to 21-year-olds when they come out and say, "Hey, that was on me. I messed that up." Bennett's done that. And it's a top-down thing. And I think you'd love to see it come from the head coach where there's some great quotes that both Matt and Jared wrote a little bit about in the last 24 hours since Dan's press conference from Dan about just what's the fallout of a game like that, and kind of how do you handle those situations? And in these instances, I just keep thinking about what Dan has said, which is that growth mindset of you are constantly trying to learn and get better. And Dan didn't hide from the fact that he spent all day Sunday in the office sharing time with recruiting, but also of making some really honest assessments that the hard facts are on film and it's hard to ignore. And that, there are some things that he wishes in retrospect he would have done differently. And that's what you want to hear after a game like this. You don't want to hear a coach point the finger. It makes me think of, and maybe this is unfair, but I just remember last year. Do you guys remember this weird, after the UCLA game, the weird press conference with Mario, where Mario put all the blame on Joe Moorhead for the passing at the end of the game where Anthony Brown was intercepted? And then Moorhead came out, and I asked Moorhead, I was like, "Mario just said this." And Moorhead says, "Wait, who said that?" And I was like, "The head coach." And he goes, "Well, the head coach said that." Yeah. And you could just see on Joe's face kind of being like,
what the hell?
I just got thrown fully under the bus there. Like, shouldn't the head coach be taking some of the accountability? You get none of that from Dan. None of that of what Mario did in terms of offsetting it and putting it somewhere else. Dan even said, "I'm not a finger pointer, I'm a thumb pointer," points to himself. So I thought that stuff was really impressive. I think, and I saw it on the comments on social media, on YouTube and on our site, of people who watched the press conference, read the transcripts, all came away feeling, I think, like how we felt, which is discouraged by the loss and by some of the reasons you lost, but encouraged by the way Dan's kind of handled himself, comported himself in the aftermath.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly how Dan should handle himself. That's what he has preached this entire time. That's what he has preached since his introductory press conference at the University of Oregon and becoming the head coach here. It's very nice to see it after a huge loss, even immediately after in the game. On Saturday, he took a lot of blame, and then obviously going back watching film, he took even more blame. But that's exactly what you want your head coach to do. He is a leader of men. He is not somebody who was there to blame other people for some of the fault, some of the things that happened, even though it might be someone else's fault. He's there to take responsibility and accountability because those are his guys, those are his coaches, those are his players. So I do think it's great that Dan took accountability and didn't blame it on anybody else, but from how he talks and how being a head coach should be, I think that's exactly what Dan intended, and I think that he did exactly what he should have done there. I think I don't have, you guys have covered basically those topics. The fourth down call, I will say once again, I'm fine with it. It's okay. It's just that the timeout there would have made a significant difference. And we deliberated post game, Eric and I. They had 2 timeouts, not just one. So there was an opportunity for them to use it if they wanted to. I think it was interesting that Dan put it so it's like, oh, well, we didn't really like the look that we saw. I think he just said that to a little bit of a scapegoat so they didn't throw Ty right under the bus, because it's like, well, I didn't know if Bo was really ready. I don't want to necessarily take out Ty in that circumstance, so I'm just going to say, we didn't like the look, even though I think, on replay it looks pretty bad. But you also have to remember that Oregon starting center and right guard are both out. I think Feope Alaulu was in on that drive. Jackson Powers-Johnson was a center. It's just a whole cluster for Oregon's offensive line and offense in general, that whole drive. But should we jump into some of the Utah stuff and do a little bit of
let's take a quick
deliberation
break
on that? Okay.
Yeah, we'll take a quick break and then we'll come back and dive into what Dan said about Utah and our thoughts on this upcoming game as well. All right, welcome back to the Odds and Audibles podcast. Matt Premier, Eric Scopel, Jared Mack, and now it's senior day. It's the tough task. Look, we said at the beginning of the year, this would be the toughest stretch of football Oregon would play. They would play their rival Washington. We all thought they would win. I mean, even the week of, we thought Oregon would win and they would cover. We obviously did not see that happen. And now they have to go and they have to play maybe the most consistent team in the league the last couple of seasons, and the Pac-12 champs in the Utah Utes, a team that destroyed them 2 times in a span of 3 weeks. It was not pretty. We don't ever see Oregon get blown out in games like that, and it happened twice in 3 weeks. And this is going to be the next challenge. I mean, look, even with a healthy Bo Nix or a healthy Alex Forsyth or Ryan Walk, Oregon could lose this game. And a season that goes from being potentially in the college football playoff comes crashing down to now they have 3 losses and 10 wins is not even on the table guaranteed. This is going to be a tough test. Dan's comments about Utah, very complimentary. He understands the task at hand. I think watching the passion come out of him Monday night was pretty cool. And I think he's pretty fired up that this is like just another really big game. As DJ Johnson put it, post practice Tuesday, like if you're not fired up for this game already, like even before the stuff that happened last year between these 2 teams, like you have problems. Like this should be a really big game for Oregon's players, and it feels like it is.
It has to be. I mean, there's so much on the table here. And, even Casey Rogers, who's new to playing in this conference and for this team, wasn't on last year's team, communicated that it was very clear to him what this game means, that the players that he's spoken to on this defense, on this team that played in last year's game, did not have a good time, do not think highly of the way that they played last year, that the film doesn't look good. He says he's seen some of the film from last year. He understands why. Oregon got outplayed in those games, and we don't even have to relitigate any of that. I mean, we can maybe litigate on this week when we get into our predictions of some of the stuff that happened last year and if those same pitfalls can bite Oregon again. But last year's games were gross, very disappointing. And I think it's interesting kind of looking at this matchup now and saying, okay, where has the growth been from this program and how is Utah different? I think that's kind of the way we're going to look at this week. Is Utah has a lot of the same cast of characters offensively that you'll recognize, defensively, some different pieces, but from a approach perspective, they're still really aggressive. Landing noted that they blitz on, or they bring extra pressure on 28% of downs, which is really a very high rate. That they do some kind of unorthodox things. He also noted that when he was at Georgia, one of the years, the entire Georgia defensive staff went and met with Coach Whittingham in Salt Lake City, I believe, to go over some of the things that they're doing defensively. So There's a lot of admiration from Dan, who is obviously a defensive-minded coach, somebody who's grown up trying to, grow as a defensive coach with what Utah does. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges here is that even last week in the loss, Oregon had almost 600 yards of offense. They easily could have scored 40 points if not for a play here, play there. Utah might make it difficult to get back to that point. And Utah has also shown that when they do get in a shootout, like against USC, they're very much capable offensively of hanging around. And I think Dan was really complimentary, as he should be, of Cameron Rising, who is the veteran quarterback, who threw for 415 yards in the game against USC earlier this year. It's kind of interesting, though. Jared and I were talking about this when we were at Starbucks after the practice today, of like how my memory of those games maybe differs from what the stats tell me, because Cameron Rising's stats in those two losses were not that impressive. He had like 174 yards on average. He had 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. He had some pretty good rushing stats one of the games, but it's not like it blows you away. I'm not diminishing him at all. But I'm just saying, like, when I think about that game, those games, I just think, oh man, like he must have been firing on all cylinders, and he really wasn't. And that could even be a negative thing, where you say Utah was able to mash them pretty good. And I understand part of it was they were able to run the ball really effectively, and Oregon made so many mistakes. You didn't have to get, there were special teams mistakes, there were offensive mistakes, there were turnovers. So Utah didn't necessarily have to amass a ton of yards. But like, if Cam Rising is even put in a spot where, let's say, Oregon has more success offensively this time around, which is hard not to. They gained it's 7 points in one game and 10 in the other. But let's say they make it more competitive and they challenge Rising to make plays. Like, he's somebody who is very much capable of making those plays. He's shown it in big moments, and he hasn't necessarily even shown it and needed to show it in this rivalry. So I think it's going to be a really interesting game when we get a little further into it. I think the other thing that'll be interesting is the things that Washington does out of its offense are not the same things you should expect Utah to do. They can try to mimic.
So different.
They can try to mimic some of it if they want to play copycat, as Dan will tell you. But the kind of the base personality of this Utah offense is very much different than what Washington does. So some of the things that we saw Washington absolutely embarrass Oregon doing aren't things that Utah does week to week or almost kind of on a natural basis. So you could possibly talk yourself into in this matchup of, is Utah going to be able to do or have as much success as Washington did in this matchup? Or will they seek out other areas where they usually have a lot of success, i.e. throwing to the tight ends and powering it up the middle with its run game with a really strong offensive line? And if they, depending upon what they do, like, could that actually, like, how much of that plays into Oregon's strengths defensively, which in theory should be defending those types of plays? So trying to give you a little bit more of a glass half full. Trying to do it this week. People in the comments didn't like my approach on Monday's podcast, trying to give a glass half full tie perspective. But if you want to talk Oregon's defense, which we've been really critical of late, Utah's offense might be like kind of not the worst matchup for them in terms of at least how they typically approach things.
Yeah, like I mentioned, they're so much different than how Washington runs their offense. Washington, like I said all last week, is really familiar to just an all-out aerial attack. It's like a run and shoot almost type of offense, a Mike Leach style, where they're going to go 5 wide most of the time. And Utah could go 5 wide, but that's just not how they run their offense. That's not how Cameron Rising is built. That's not how Tavion Thomas is effectively used on their offense, or how their offensive line is, again, effectively used. They'll be 12, 13, 14 personnel. They're going to run the ball, as DJ Johnson and Dan Lanning said, they're going to try to run the ball down your throat. It's going to be, I think it's going to be similar to how sometimes how Oregon runs their offense, where they go big packages, they go 12 or 13 personnel. They'll take the opportunities to run the ball down your throat. But that's kind of how Utah runs their offense all the time. And Dan mentioned it in his Monday press conference, is like, they're going to run the ball until they can't. And once you take too advantageous of a jump and try to stop the run game, they're going to hit you deep. And that's similar to what Oregon does. They'll run the ball until the opposing team tries to stop the run. Then they'll hit somebody deep because their linebackers bite or their safeties bite. It's a good offense. And it's one of the better offenses in the Pac-12. They score nearly 40 points a night. They're capable of getting into shootouts. I know it is against USC, like Eric mentioned, and USC's defense isn't the greatest, but and when it gets to a shootout, Oregon probably isn't the greatest either. I think they're right there with USC in terms of allowing yards through the air. It's not necessarily two titans of the world going at each other in those defensive perspectives, but it's going to be a fun one. I think we looked at Rising stats in the last couple of times these two teams has faced, or the last two times, excuse me, and they haven't been great, but they haven't needed to be great. Obviously, those are two blowout wins, and Oregon just eventually made a lot of mistakes. Obviously, the special teams issues with Britton Covey and the punt return there at the end of the first half of the first game, a pick six in the Pac-12 championship game. Limiting mistakes is going to be another key scenario. There, Dan talked about a couple of mistakes that they made against Washington, where there was the onside kick, the fumble, the red zone. Those are the type of things that can't happen in this game, especially against the number 10 team in the country. Oregon is just a 3-point favorite in this game. The line opened at 6. It ended up dropping to 3. This is, like Matt, I think, opened the segment with, there's no guarantee that this is a 10-win season. This could very quickly drop to a 9-3 or an 8-4 type of season. And Oregon has to come out guns a-blazing. They have to play like their hair is on fire, because this is what, this is the last kind of opportunity to make a run here, to get to that Pac-12 championship game and to get themselves in a better position to potentially get into one of those New Year's Six bowls. So I'm excited for this game. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. These are two teams who are very talented and very well coached. And, one coach is, Whittingham, is on his way out. Dan's on his way in. I think it's going to be a really fun matchup in Autzen on Saturday.
Yeah, it's a top 15 matchup going into this one, and it's going to be an exciting one, a close game. I would be surprised if this is a blowout either direction, and unless maybe we don't have a full complement of players for Oregon. If that's the case, then yeah, it gets scary for Oregon. But there's a lot of storylines to watch. We're gonna play it out here on the podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. We're gonna wrap it up here. We'll be back later this week with Steve Bartle from Ute Zone. He'll come on and give us a preview of this game, and then we'll make our predictions later on Friday. And then next time you'll hear from us after that is a post-game, very early Sunday morning, 7:30 kickoff. Remember that on ESPN. Until then, you've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.